Hello, welcome to CubsPS Plus, the Northside Numbers Game, a weekly podcast that dives headfirst into the analysis of hot topics driving Chicago Cubs baseball. I'm your host, Mike Waller, a lifelong Cub fan, full-time baseball stat nerd, and for another week, a youth baseball coach. CubsPS Plus is part of the Bleacher Bunch Productions on the Fans First Sports Network, joining great shows like The Sun Ranto Show, Cup of Cubby Blue, and Baseball Rabbit Hole. The Bleacher Bunch feed is available wherever it is you get your podcasts, and CubsPS Plus is always available ad-free to Patreon supporters at patreon.com/CubsPS Plus, where you can support the show and find a variety of benefits for as little as $1 a month. In addition to the podcast feeds, you can also find me on Twitter or X, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, Blue Sky, and YouTube, all at CubsPS Plus, the spin on the baseball metric OPS Plus. Love the pod or hate it? Please drop a review wherever it is you get your podcasts. If you've done that, thank you so much. Maybe you can share the episode with a friend. It's October 29th, and the Dodgers are going to try to sweep the Yankees out of the series tonight in the Bronx. While I still have the chance, let's talk about these playoffs and what recent history tells us about what it takes to have success. We'll play a little fact or fiction today. Are you ready? I'm ready. Here we go. Welcome into episode 91. No Cub has ever worn number 91, so let's use 91 to highlight a stark difference between the Cubs and the Dodgers, who might be on the verge of winning the World Series tonight. To look at a 91-game postseason sample size for the Cubs, you have to include every postseason appearance going back to the 1932 World Series when they got swept by the Yankees in the infamous Babe Ruth called shot series. For the Dodgers, to get 91 postseason games, you got to go all the way back to 2016. I mean, that's just such a stark difference. I mean, the Dodgers are there year after year after year after year. The Yankees have been in the postseason quite a bit. They've won quite a few games. They seem to... I thought this series was going to be better, so we'll get into that. But with this episode, I want to get into some fact or fiction with regard to the playoffs and going deep and getting to the World Series. But first, let's talk about the series. I mean, coming into the series or coming into the postseason, I look at a lot of baseball social media, I listen to a lot of podcasts, and the general sentiment was anti-Dodgers, anti-Yankees, short of maybe rooting for Shohei since he had all those years in LA for the Angels with no playoff appearances. A lot of people cheering on the kind of the quirky upstart Tigers and the upstart, or not so much the upstart, but the Padres were a hot team. The Mets had everything from Grimace to the Hawk-Tua girl going for them in this season. So sort of this, I've seen them referred to a lot as the zombie Mets. And, that was a cool story going for a while. Philly's a lot of fun. I mean, there are a lot of teams to like in this playoffs this year. Personally, I've not liked the Yankees and Dodgers for most of my life. I've said multiple times my parents were Yankee fans, and they were the ones that introduced me to the game and eventually converted to picking up the Cubs in addition to the Yankees. But that's a function of they were watching who they could see on TV when they were kids. Growing up in the 60s in Iowa, there weren't games on like there are today where you can get a team. I can spend living in Charlotte, North Carolina, I can spend the entire season basically just watching the Cubs if I want to. That was not an option then, but that's how I picked up the Cubs. I picked up the Cubs by watching the Cubs on WGN all the time as a kid because we had cable and I had access to it. But I've always been anti-Dodgers, sort of because the first World Series I remember is the 81 series, the last time the Yankees played the Dodgers. It was Fernando Valenzuela was big into that, Orel Hershiser, Greg Nettles, Dave Winfield, Reggie Jackson. I mean, that whole class of the era. The Yankees and Dodgers played, I think, 3 times in 4 years in the World Series. And that was kind of my introduction. So, of course, I was introduced to the World Series essentially by Yankees fans. So Dodgers were already on the bad list. But when I look at these teams, I still don't like the Dodgers. I never have. I probably never will. But when I actually look at the team, I'm hard-pressed to find a player I don't like. I mean, I love Shohei Ohtani. He's so much fun to watch. Freddie Freeman is just a treasure. And he is on fire. He's hit home runs now in 5 straight World Series games, going back to the 2021 series with the Braves. That's nuts. And you've got Mookie Betts. How can you not like Mookie Betts? Aaron Judge, Juan Soto, Garrett Cole, Giancarlo Stanton. I mean, just a lot of really fun and talented baseball players to watch. And this year, the World Series, as much as that wasn't the series I came into this, I was kind of rooting for Padres and Tigers. Tigers were kind of the quirky little upstart, and the Padres have a really good team. They've spent a lot of money on that team, and they're playing well. And I wanted them to stick it to the Dodgers and continue on. I've never really liked the Mets either, but this year's Mets team was kind of fascinating to watch, and they played really, really well since June. So kind of had that vibe to it. But the last 2 years are such a contrast in types of World Series. Last year we get the Rangers and the Diamondbacks, two wildcard teams that frankly were not that far away from not even making the playoffs. And the Diamondbacks were they wound up the second wild card, I think, but they got in with 84 wins. I think maybe they were tied with Miami. I forget how that tiebreak came out, but they had one of the lowest win totals to qualify for the playoffs in this recent era. And a lot of what I'm going to do, I'm going to make a lot of comparisons. I went back in all four pro sports. I wanted to compare parity, the idea of how teams compete, which sports are maybe more dominated by big winners or dynasties or that type of thing, and see if there's a big difference. And so I chose to go back just because I wanted to pick up a good sample size. I wanted to include 2020 because it was weird in all sports, but also have it not be a major part of the sample. Like I wouldn't pick a 5-year sample and include 2020, but I picked a 15-year sample, so it does include 2020, and I think that's okay. So a lot of this is going to go back 15 years. I've done analysis like this at times off and on over the years. You can go back further than 2015 as long as you're comparing free agency eras in all the sports. The numbers don't really change that much. So I could go back 20, I could go back 25. I could probably go back, I can't quite go back 40 because that's the collusion period in MLB where there really wasn't the player movement that you would see later, starting really in the late 80s, 90s into the 2000s. But so I'm going to talk a lot about that. Last year was kind of the aberration. You had the two, I don't want to exactly call Texas an upstart. They spent quite a bit of money. They had a top 10 payroll and they had some star power. I mean, they had Corey Seager and they paid for some pitching and Marcus Semien. They had picked up, two of the biggest name shortstops on the free agent market the year before. And so that team was talented. That team had a lot going for it. And then Arizona just kind of got hot late and got in. And there are people who were kind of rooting for those teams and liked the fact that, scrappy upstart Diamondbacks could make the playoffs, make the World Series, and kind of knock out some juggernauts. And then at the same time, you hear the complaints about, this is the last thing baseball wanted was a Texas-Arizona World Series because nobody's going to watch. And then all I heard this year coming in when it was Yankees-Dodgers was, two teams that bought their way to the World Series. Everybody's bored with the Yankees and Dodgers. Nobody's going to watch. Obviously it's not the same people. There are two clear camps in this. And I think baseball fans as a collective, don't quite know what they want. Mostly they want their team in. If their team is in, it's an epic World Series. If their team is out, it's a bunch of crap and, there are flaws in the system. But I'm not going to make this a baseball is a perfect sport because it's not. There are a lot of issues in terms of the economic structure. There are a lot of issues with regard to competitive balance. A lot of this competitive balance gets pointed at with regard to the system and the way baseball is set up. I would take it the other direction. I think a lot of times it points at the owner. And we'll get into that a lot through this episode. But the last two World Series have given you two very clear and opposite examples of ways to make the playoffs. And honestly, if you can get in and win, there's no wrong way to do it. If the Cubs sneak in next year with 83 wins, let's set aside all the angst of the Cubs winning 83 games again after the last two 83 win seasons. But if they do that and then actually win the World Series, we can talk about all the perverse incentives and all the things that would do, but we would be damn happy with that season. I know I would be. I'm sure I'll go ahead and speak for you and you would be as well. On the flip side, we also see plenty of teams go out, spend a ton of money. I mean, the Padres have spent probably way beyond what people thought they were capable of because, spoiler alert here, the owners are all billionaires. So they can choose to compete if they want to. The Mets have spent a ton of money. Last year, they didn't even make the playoffs and they had to sell off a bunch of their buys midseason to kind of restructure and redirect. It worked. They had a good team this year. They had probably the best team in baseball after around June 1st. But there are a lot of ways to do this and a lot of ways to win. And I'm going to get into some of that today. And so let's start with just comparing across the sports. So I went back again, 15 seasons, and I went ahead and included this baseball season since we're down to the final two teams. I more or less know like it's the number 2 payroll against the number 3 payroll. It's the team with the most wins, the Dodgers with 98, playing the team with the second most wins, the Yankees at 96 or 94. No, third most wins at 94. The Phillies won 95. Sorry about that. And so NFL, I didn't include this NFL season. It's just too new. So I went back 1 year further with that and went with last year's Super Bowl champion. But when you get into it, at the root level, every NBA, NFL, NHL, and Major League Baseball, in that 15-year time window, every team in every league made the playoffs at least once. For teams that missed the playoffs over the last 10 years, Major League Baseball, NFL, and NHL each have one team. Missing the playoffs in the last 5 years, baseball has 3, the NBA has 3, the NFL has 4, and the NHL has 5. So when you look at it that way, baseball has as much parity as the other sports, arguably more, because 27 of the 30 teams made the postseason in the last 5 years. The longest current streak in each league for not making the playoffs is the Angels for Major League Baseball. They haven't been in since 2014. In the NBA, my hometown Charlotte Hornets have not sniffed the playoffs since 2016. In the NFL, the Jets have not been to the playoffs since 2010. And in the NHL, the Buffalo Sabres have not been to the playoffs since 2010. What's really interesting when you look a little bit deeper is how many teams make the playoffs. So in Major League Baseball, now that we've expanded the playoffs, 12 teams make the postseason. So 12 out of 30 teams, that's 38% of the league every year makes the postseason. That's by far the smallest. In the NBA, with their addition now to have the sort of the play-in rounds, they actually have 20 of the 30 teams make the postseason every year. So you want to talk about taking playoffs and changing it to, quote, postseason tournament. I mean, that's the NBA in spades. And so it's not surprising now that no team has missed the playoffs in the last 10 years. You're taking 2/3 of the league in every year. And you don't have to rise that far. Teams with losing records do make the playoffs in the NBA. And it's a big indictment of the Charlotte Hornets to have not been in since 2016. Given this, I think a couple of years before they added those extra play-in rounds, I think the Hornets would have if that had been in place. But still, in the NFL, 14 out of 32 teams make it. So less than half still, 43%. That's 5% higher than Major League Baseball. And in the NHL, 16 out of 32 make it. So 50% of hockey makes it in the playoffs every year. And one thing I want to really focus on today is not just making the playoffs, but making noise in the playoffs. I will say that should be the goal. However, particularly in baseball, any playoff series is a small sample size. We're just talking about noise. So it's hard to structure a team, build it up, set projections. You can build a team that's projected or expected to win 95 or 100 games. The best teams in baseball, when the Cubs won 103 and won the World Series in 2016, they had a stretch in late June, right before the All-Star break, where they played atrocious baseball. You can go in the tank for 10 days pretty easily, and pretty much every team does at some point. So when you're talking about playoff runs anyway, you're talking about sample size and noise. But when we look at how many teams have won championships, so let's look at the parity from the other end, not just making the playoffs, but championships. So in the NHL over the last 15 years, they've had 10 different franchises win championships. And that's really been the standard number. Every single one, well, to be determined still, but now it's looking like baseball will still be at 10. MLB, NFL, NBA, and the NHL all have had 10 unique champions in the last 10 years, as long as the Dodgers win the series. If the Yankees come back and win, that'll make it 11 for baseball, which again would be more parity than the other sports. If you look at how many teams made the World Series, made the Super Bowl, made it to the Stanley Cup, or made it to the NBA Finals, 17 different teams have made it to the World Series in the last 15 years. In the NFL, 17 different teams. So for baseball, that's 17 out of 30. For the NFL, it's 17 out of 32 have made it to the Super Bowl. In the NBA, 12 out of 30 have made it to the NBA Finals. And really, if you look at it for appearances in the Stanley Cup, NHL probably has the most parity with 19 different teams, 19 out of 32 teams making it to the semifinals, or making it to whatever the final is. If you take that back one step further and just look at the semifinals, so that would be the championship series in baseball, the conference championship games in the NFL, the conference championships in the NBA, and I think it's the same in hockey. I'm not a huge hockey guy, so you guys can call me out in the notes for my lack of hockey knowledge. But 25 of the 30 teams in the NHL have made it at least to the conference championship. 21 of 30 in the NBA have made it to the conference championship. Surprisingly to me, 25 of 32 teams have made it to a conference championship game in the last 15 years in the NFL. And for baseball, 22 different teams out of 30 have made it to a league championship series. And so really the parity across the sports is pretty close. I mean, depending on which level you want to point to, you might point to the most number of champions. You might point to the most number of appearances in the championship round. You might point to essentially the conference championships, the division, the league championship series in baseball are all effectively semifinals. So if you want to look to semifinal appearances and see how far that spreads around, they're all pretty close. But then you have to look at it with the grain of salt that only 38% of baseball makes it to the playoffs every year. I mean, you should have a lot of teams making a lot of appearances in the NBA when 2/3 of the league make it every year. You should have a decent spread in the NFL. And the other piece is it's funny to have that with the economic structures so different across the different leagues. And this is where I want to start getting into some of the fact or fiction here. So let's get back to that. So the first one I want to talk about is baseball's economic structure leads to haves and have-nots that hurt parity in the game. Now, some of this is, of course, it's all going to be my opinion, but I think it's pretty well fiction. I think we just went through all the parity. I think baseball has as much parity or more compared to the other big four sports in the league. I think you do not have to really believe in Moneyball. I love the movie. I really enjoyed the book. There's a lot of good stuff in it conceptually. It's a lot of what set us on the direction the game is going now. There are also some real fallacies in there. There is a reality with some teams. Tampa is one, Oakland is one. Other teams are at times where there is sort of the idea of there's everybody else, there's 50 feet of crap, and then there's the us. Part of the us, though, is choice. John Fisher is a very, very, very wealthy man. He takes in a lot of money in revenue sharing from other teams and does not consistently put that back into the product on the baseball field. When the A's have done things like draft well, scout well, develop players well, they had a good run in the late 90s, early 2000s. They were in the playoffs as often as anybody and not spending that much money. Tampa, fell off this year, but they've had a good run over the last 10, 15 years where they've made it to a couple World Series, haven't won a championship, but they have been in the playoffs surprisingly regularly given what they spend. That doesn't have to be the be all end all of what does it. So I think baseball is able to overcome that. I think So I think the idea that baseball's economic structure prevents teams from competing is largely fiction. When you look at, and that feeds into my next one, baseball's economic model makes it easier for the rich to win. I will give that some partial truth. I think that's a fact, maybe not 100% fact, but probably 90%. It does make it easier. When we look at payrolls, I just broke down the World Series teams going back to 2010 to include those 15 years. Now, for this one, talking about money, I could only go back to 2011. I was using SpotTrack as my source for team spending. And for the record, if you hear these ranks and have some disagreement, I used what's on SpotTrack each season. I used the tax payroll. So some years teams are paying more, but when you use AAV, and I wanted to count what's going on against the tax because the CBT is really what's driving a lot of teams' budgets. That's what's driving deferred money. That's what's driving, are the Cubs going to go above or below the tax? That's very much, the threshold that we're looking at. This year we got one extreme. This year we have the number 2 and number 3 payrolls in baseball. The Mets were number 1. So we had 3 of the top 4 in the league championship series. Last year was a bit of an aberration the other way. We had Texas with the number 8 payroll, so a top 10 payroll. That's entirely legitimate. And Arizona got in at number 19. Go back, I'll cherry pick a couple others. 2020 was a weird season. I said I was including it here. The reason I'm including it here is to win a championship, you still have to be the best of all the teams playing in the same framework that season. So 30 Major League Baseball teams did play 60-game seasons. There was an expanded playoff, and every team in that playoff had to run the same gauntlet to get to the championship. So, would a Dodgers fan tell you, and I know Dodgers fans are kind of looking online, they're very tired of people running down that championship. I think they would probably tell you in their heart of hearts that it's not as special to them as, say, the Kirk Gibson World Series in 1988 was, or some of the other ones they won before that. But it's still a ring. They won it fair and square. But it's just different. Like, fans didn't have a chance to go to the games that season, so the fans don't get to interact with it. Fans didn't have those special moments at the ballpark in 2020. But that was the number 5 payroll for the Dodgers against Tampa with the number 27 payroll that year. The 2 years before that, we had Washington with the 6th highest against Houston with the 5th highest. We had Boston with the number 1 overall payroll in 2018, beating the Dodgers, who had the 4th biggest payroll overall. What's interesting is you can also, if you look at these year over year, Houston's a really good example. So Houston famously had the tank and the rebuild, and they first made the World Series in 2017 when they had the 19th highest payroll. It's not because they were small market or not spending. It was because they were made up of young players and they hadn't really added a ton of pieces. Excuse me. So you look at Houston in 2017, they were the 19th highest payroll. When they made the World Series again in 2019, they were 5th. When they made it again in 2021, they were 7th. When they made it in 2022, they were 9th. So once they got to the point where the team was good and competitive, they kept a top 10 payroll, sometimes top 5. Dodgers are typically up there. I mean, look at the Dodgers' appearances in the World Series starting with 2017. In 2017, they were the number 1 spending team in baseball. In 2020, they were 5th. This year, they are pretty sure they're 3rd, but they might be 2nd. I can't remember. And they're only that because of the deferred money for Shohei Ohtani. I mean, they're spending as much as anybody in baseball. But what's interesting to me is, what can teams do? And the reason I say it's partial fact here is obviously you can get there if you don't spend a ton of money. I've mentioned a couple examples already, Arizona and Tampa. When Cleveland faced the Cubs in 2016, they were 21st. When the Mets lost to Kansas City in 2015, they were 21st. When Kansas City lost to San Francisco in 2014, they were 19th. You can have a bottom half payroll and make it to the World Series. It's harder to do because we talk about it all the time here. We're going to get into it a ton this offseason as we look at roster building. You can even pay one big star and keep a low payroll. When people say there's no money, the Cubs don't have the money to fit Juan Soto in, garbage. They can. You give him $50 million per season. It looks like projections are going to be more probably in the teams will add enough years to that deal that'll be in the probably mid 40s. But, you have 241 million in 2025 before you hit the CBT. You can pay one guy 50. You just have to cut from other places. And the Cubs do not have so many expensive things, but that's a different episode for a different day. But teams can do this. We have the Kansas City Royals this year up their payroll game because they're paying Bobby Witt Jr. They picked up a couple other free agents, but they're not carrying a big payroll. The Tampa Bay unfortunately paid Wander Franco. At the time, it looked like, oh my gosh, they're actually investing in one of their young stars, and now he's looking at a lot of prison time in the Dominican, things I would really rather not talk about on the show. But when you look at it, so the average rank of teams that make the World Series, the average payroll rank of teams that win the World Series going back to 2011 is 7.3. So around this seventh highest payroll in baseball is about average. For the team losing the World Series, it's 11.7, so closer to 12th. Either way, top half payroll. And the lowest team to win it was Houston in 2017 with 19th highest payroll plus whatever they spent on trash cans. Atlanta was 13th in 2021. Kansas City was 11th in 2015. Otherwise, every other World Series champion has had a top 10 payroll. On the back end, I've highlighted some of the exceptions. So when you really break it down, if we look at the top 25, let's start with top half payroll. Looking at this is effectively 14 World Series because I couldn't include 2010. I didn't have the numbers. So for 28 teams appearing in those 14 World Series, 13 of the winners and 9 of the losers. So 13 of 14 winners were top 50% in baseball. And 9 of the 14 losers were top 15 payroll in baseball. Look at top 10s, it's 11 of 14 and 8 for the losers. And then 8 of the top payrolls were 8 of the 14 World Series were a top 25% payroll in baseball. So it does. I would say the economic model, spending more money makes it easier to go. And it's obvious, right? You can, if you're spending more money, you can theoretically get, either more star power, or even in some cases, it makes the difference between having 3 good starters to being able to have a 4th good starter, or to have a good bench or a deeper lineup. You look at the lineups this year. Obviously the Yankees and Dodgers are spending a ton of money, but you have to face the Dodgers and you got to go through Shohei Ohtani, Mookie Betts, Freddie Freeman, Will Smith, Max Muncy. That lineup just goes on for days. And the Yankees have not quite as deep, but they've got Aaron Judge, Giancarlo Stanton, Gleyber Torres, Jazz Chisholm. It's deep and it matters. And being able to, and also we saw with the Dodgers this year, their pitching really struggled during most of the season. They had a ton of injuries. Tyler Glasnow is not pitching in the World Series, but they were able to keep throwing money at the problem, and they're able to just keep going and trying to find guys. They made trades. They picked up Jack Flaherty. They picked up Michael Kopech at the trade deadline. They were able to just keep going and try to keep patching over. So that's where it's largely a fact. The one thing I'll hedge on it is I don't think it's exactly baseball's economic model. I think it's a lot of ownership choice. I think there's a lot of that going on. So the next one I want to tackle is star power is essential to winning championships. Now, this is a little bit subjective because what is star power? If there's a player nobody's ever heard of before this season and all of a sudden splashes on the scene with a 7 WAR season, is that player a star? Or what about a guy who's been a star most of his career? Giancarlo Stanton, 5 years ago, absolutely a star. Now he's been really good in the playoffs, but would he be considered a star? He's a very good player. He's got that name recognition, but he's not, current day Mookie Betts, Shohei Ohtani level performance. So while it's subjective, I'm going to say it's fiction. and I'll use a couple examples to point this out. So this year we have the probable MVPs of each league matching up in the World Series. That's been really rare. The last time that happened, so that I'm assuming at this point that Aaron Judge and Shohei Ohtani are going to win the 2 league MVPs. Maybe they won't, and it'll make this point moot. But either way, they're going to be in the. There's no way either one of them is outside the top 2 in their league voting. So the last time 2 MVPs of that season matched up in the World Series was 2012, when the Giants beat the Tigers, and you had Buster Posey with the Giants going up against Miguel Cabrera for the Tigers. That's vintage era. I think that was the year Miggy won the Triple Crown. That might have been 2011, but it's that era of Miguel Cabrera. I mean, the dude was hitting everything remotely close to him. And before that, to get a World Series featuring that season's 2 MVPs, which is a little bit different than just star power, but stick with me on this. You have to go back to 88 when it was Kirk Gibson and Jose Canseco for the Dodgers and the A's matched up in the World Series. Obviously, we saw what Kirk Gibson did that year. And when you look through, in 2018, Boston had Mookie Betts. He won the league MVP that year. Jose Altuve in 2017 won the MVP and was in the World Series with Houston. 2016, Chris Bryant won the National League MVP and was in the World Series with the Cubs. So it certainly helps. And you have to have good players. And this is where I talked on one of my last episodes about Jed Hoyer and his comment about having to beat projections. He's right that you do, but he puts it in the wrong context all the time and just kind of hangs it out there as some sort of truism the world's supposed to say, okay, yeah, that's right. You need to have a lot of really good players to get to the World Series. I mean, that, right? Can I say anything that's more obvious than that? But to get there, to put your kind of team in that threshold where you're in position to win, where you can get home field in the playoff series, when you can get yourself maybe that break. I think this year people have calmed down a little bit about the bye being a disadvantage. And I think we just kind of have to point back to, we'll need more years watching this, but I think it's more the noise. And sometimes the teams that get those buys haven't had to play a really meaningful, intense series in 4 to 6 weeks before the playoffs hit. So those teams kind of coast into the end. The Philly got knocked out this year, but Philly played kind of 500 baseball over the last month and a half. They ran out to a big lead and just kind of coasted on to the finish. And we're certainly not playing as well as the Padres and Braves were at the end of the season. But to the star power, I mean, I wouldn't say Arizona had a lot of star power when they made the playoffs last year. The Rangers certainly had some. They had Corey Seager, Marcus Semien. They had good pitching. They had, and they had guys who were elevating themselves that season. So you want to get yourself in position with guys that play beyond their projections. I mean, Shohei Ohtani this year, as great as we already knew Shohei Ohtani was, I think had a better offensive season than anybody would have projected. He just maybe focusing on one thing makes him actually better, but still, I mean, it was incredible. And guys do have plus seasons. Aaron Judge was almost as good as he was 2 years ago. And you get a lot of that. You don't necessarily have to have the big star. 2021, the Braves had a lot of stars-ish, but they were on the younger side. They still had Freddie Freeman. Acuna was a Brave, but he missed the second half of that season with injuries. And some of the guys they had, like Austin Riley and Ozzie Albies, were just younger guys. So, we might consider them stars now. I'm not sure we necessarily always did in 2021. Some of the guys, yes, some no. Dodgers have always been loaded with talent. The Washington Nationals finally got their ring in 2019, the year after Bryce Harper left. Not that they didn't have other, they had Max Scherzer and they had Strasburg that year, had a really good year. And they certainly had good players. They had Juan Soto. Young Juan Soto was on that team. Mookie Betts with Boston. I mean, so it helps to have good players. I don't know that it's essential to really, when you're looking at pure star power, like if you have a team that's really good, really deep, and you need to go get more pieces, if you can get a star, awesome. Like what team in baseball wouldn't Juan Soto make better next year? But maybe that's only one team's going to get him anyway. And maybe it's better to add that one more starting pitcher. Maybe it's better to add two more bullpen arms. Maybe it's better to fill that one positional hole that you have that Juan Soto can't fill. So there are a lot of options to it. Obviously, you have to have a lot of good players, but I'm going to say it's fiction to say that star power is essential to winning championships. It takes me to the last one, the one that gets a lot of talk. I've talked about it on this show. I know Sanranto has talked about it a good bit. It's been all over. Big Effectively Wild fan. They talk about it a lot there. There's this new, with the third wild card, when you look down the list in National League, there's only been this year, 2022, 2018, where 86 wins wouldn't have gotten you at least tied for the last wild card spot. This year it took 89, 87, or 22, it was 87. And some of it's not entirely a great comparison because prior to the change in adding that third wildcard team, there was nobody was competing for third. You'd compete for the top two. So like in 2015, when the Pirates and Cubs won 98, 97 games, taking the two wildcard spots, third place would have been 84. I mean, there's such a big difference. Nobody was trading for extra parts at the deadline, really trying to get from like 84 up to 88, 89. So some of those likely would have been higher if teams were truly competing for that spot. But last year we saw the Diamondbacks make it into 84 wins. And so there's this sense now that just aim, get that mid 80s level, hope for better. But if you get that mid 80s, get in, go make noise, go win yourself a championship or go make a run in the playoffs. The idea that that's good strategy to kind of balance spending and winning, I say that's absolute fiction. It's the wrong model. When you look at trying to win, the goal is to win a championship, number one, not just to make the playoffs. 2018 for me is I go back and forth on that season. On the one hand, that was a good Cubs team at 195 games. And then it became a good example of that noise, the small sample size noise at the end of the year. The Cubs had to play, I think it was 31 games in 30 days over the last month. The Brewers got absolutely red hot, won their last 8 to force game 163, then beat the Cubs in the 163. And then the Cubs had a 1-game playoff like the next day against the Rockies. And, that was the year, I guess, famously the offense was broken, but the bats really went cold late in the season and they were out quickly. Some of that's going to happen. I mean, that's the noise of the playoffs. And that is, if the Rockies just barely scraped in that year. They had another year just before the window of, I think it was 2009-ish. The Rockies made the World Series when they just got insanely hot late in the season. But if you're building for that mid 80s tier, and we're going to talk about that a lot this offseason, that's just not the right strategy. When you look at teams that go deep, and so for this, I'm using the World Series teams. Well, so let's just look at teams across the league. Craig Counsell and Jameson Taillon talked about aiming for 90 wins. Brendan Miller from CHGO talks a lot about wants to build 95, 98 win teams because, as he talks a lot about, there's that expected, most 2/3 of the league every year is within 14 games of what they were projected to be. And so if you're at 98, projected to be a 98 win team, you have a million injuries, things don't go well, you're probably going to win 84 plus. And that's a perfect example of what the Braves did this year. They lost Ronald Acuna. They lost Ozzie Albies for months at a time. They didn't have Spencer Strider at all. Tons of injuries, and they were projected to be a 98 to 100 win team. They wound up winning 89, and they still made the playoffs. So you need to aim for that. And when you look across the league, teams are doing it. Every year going back to 2010, there have been at least 6 teams win 90 games every single season. The lowest was 2014 and 2016 when only 6 teams won 90 games. And when you look at 95 wins, this year had the fewest 95 win teams of any year going back to 2010. And that was 2. It was the Phillies at 95 and the Dodgers at 98. There were some more teams at 93, 94. There were 7 90 win teams this season and 2 95 win teams. But going back, other than this year, there have been at least three. There's a couple seasons with three, as many as seven. In 2019, there were 10 teams that won 90 games and 7 teams that won 95. That's where you need. If you want to make a run, if the goal is to win a championship, that's where you need to be aiming. So the Cubs need to get off this 83, 84, 85 win projected baseline and get larger. The average World Series champion over the last 10 years has won 97 games. The average World Series loser over the last 15 years has won 94 games. Now for that, I use the winning percentages to calculate out a full season on 2020. Who knows what it would have been, but again, going back 15 years lets that be less of an aberration. And the lowest win total to win the World Series in that 15-year span is 88. It was done twice. It was the San Francisco Giants in 2014 and the Braves in 2021. The lowest win total to make it to a World Series and lose was 84, last year's Diamondbacks. But you look at this, and World Series participants have been 80%. Sorry, 80% of the World Series participants in the last 15 years have won 90 or more games. That's 24 out of 30. 53%, so more than half of the teams in the World Series over the last 15 years, 16 out of 30, have won 95 games. And more than 25%, 27%, which is 8 out of 30, have won 100 or more games, including the Cubs in 2016. That's the bar. That's where you need to be aiming. And I get, the Chicago White Sox are not going to build. They could get the best management structure in baseball. They're not going to turn this year's absolute disaster into a 98-win baseball team. So I get that there can be incremental goals along the way. But the Chicago Cubs have a top 5 most expensive baseball fan experience. They are top 5 in revenues. They have their own cable network. They own most of Wrigleyville. They have a very loyal fan base that gives them high attendance game after game, year after year. They need to aim higher. And it's not all spend. Talk about the spending and we go back to it. The team with the number 1 overall payroll over the last 15 years has won 1 championship and has had 1 World Series loss. So being the most spendy team doesn't always translate to getting you there. If you have a top 3 payroll in baseball over the last 15 years, that's equated to 3 championships and 2 World Series losses. You get to top 5, you're up to 11. 6 championships and 5 World Series losses. So money can get you there. What's most important is that obviously you have to spend it well. Guys have to perform and play. You have to stay healthy. You have to have some luck in the playoffs. But looking up and down this list, I see a lot of top 10. Top 10 payrolls, top 8 payrolls. Here are the 15 payrolls, and I'm going to assume the Dodgers win this World Series with the 3rd overall payroll. The winners working backwards: 3rd highest payroll, 8th highest payroll, 9th highest payroll, 13th, 5th, 6th, 1st, 19th, 4th, 11th, 7th, 3rd, 5th, 9th. There's a certain threshold that you have to spend. And you have to do that aiming for those win totals. The World Series champions, this year it's going to be, looks like a 98-win Dodger team. Last year was a 90-win Texas team. That was an aberration. Then you go, Houston in 2022 won 106 games. In 2020, I get that it's projection, but the Dodgers were on a 116 win pace through 60 games. They weren't going to win 116, but that team dominated start to finish. That was absolutely a 100-win talent ball club. In 2018, the Red Sox won the championship after winning 108 games. 2017, Houston won 101 and got the championship. Cubs in 2016 won 103 and got the championship. That's where they need to be aiming. And, again, it doesn't always get you there. In 2019, Houston won 107, lost the World Series to the Nationals. So there's some luck in there. But the more you get there, the more you stack up those 90, 95, 100 win seasons, you give yourself that shot more often than not. So in the coming weeks, I've got some interesting episodes coming up. Sarah Sanchez and I are going to do a collaboration and kind of redo the 2023, the previous last offseason, 2023, heading into 2024, to just look at, what other kinds of options were on the table. What other kinds of choices could Jet have made to build this year's team? So the offseason is close to starting, but I think that's going to give us an idea of kind of how to frame this up. Like, look at where was this team weak? What kind of moves could have been made? And not even just looking at like the Shohei Ohtanis of the world. Like, what could the Cubs have done in the bullpen? What could the Cubs have done on the bench? This week, I'm going to make an appearance on the Bricks Behind the Ivy podcast. We're going to talk about each come in with a couple free agents to target, and we're taking different strategies on each one. And because the Cubs have to do multiple things, they do need to add a big bat and or a frontline starting pitcher. They also need bullpen depth and they need bench help. And not every one of those, you're not going to go spend $30 million to make your bench better, but where can you find that quality player that's going to make a difference, and how can you change that out? So those couple episodes are coming up. We're going to look at a lot of trades Jed's made in the past. I think trading is going to be a big part of this offseason. The Cubs have top 100 prospects ready to go, and that's going to mean making deals, either trading the prospects for some of the pieces that they want, or potentially creating some space on the roster to get them up, or letting those guys work in and be some of that depth on the bench. So the offseason is almost here. So the clock is going to start when the World Series is over. So if the Dodgers win tonight and complete the sweep, Monday will be the first day. The teams have 5 days to make decisions on all their options. Players and teams have 5 days after the World Series to work on those options. Players who are heading into free agency have those 5 days also as an exclusive negotiating window with their own team. So while I fully expect Juan Soto to hit the market, if the Yankees go to him and say, hey, we're going to give you $1 billion to stay, he may not make it to free agency. I think that's unlikely, because I think if the Yankees are going to hand him $1 billion, he's going to look and see if he can get $1.2 billion from someone else. But that's the things. And then after that, there is the tender deadline for tendering guys' contracts is November 22nd. So 5 days after the World Series ends, free agency begins. And then roster decisions on who you tender and non-tender have to be made by November 22nd. So that will leave, depending on when exactly the World Series ends, about 2.5 to 3 weeks for those decisions to be made. And for that, we're talking all the players who are not on veteran contracts. So everybody who's pre-arbitration, everybody who's in arbitration somewhere. If you're in arbitration, the Cubs would tender a contract and figure out the money later through negotiating or taking it all the way to arbitration. And then that's going to start to show. So the full free agent field is not really fully known until November 22nd. So that's part of why when baseball hits free agency, there's kind of this lull. You might get a couple big signings. Edwin Diaz 2 off seasons ago signed his big 5-year, $100 million deal in that 5-day exclusive negotiation period. So he never actually hit free agency, but re-signed with the Mets for the big contract. You'll see there might be a couple big signings right out of the gate. Somebody might know where they want to go, and it might happen. I think Aaron Nola was pretty quick last year. Like when Cody Bellinger was made a free agent when he got non-tendered by the Dodgers, he wasn't a free agent until the Dodgers made that decision. So don't expect a ton of moves until the teams know exactly what they're working with. And once they're tendered too, the Cubs can still DFA guys. And if all of a sudden they make a signing and somebody they've already tendered a contract to, they can still go through the designated for assignment process and get them off the 40-man. The Cubs also have within that 5 days, they have to get their 40-man roster down to 40. So when you look at it, when they ended the season, the Cubs had 48 guys on their 40-man roster. And that's because of things like largely the 60-day injured list. So they have to clear those guys off the injured lists and then figure out what they're going to do. Now, some are easy. Kyle Hendricks is going to be a free agent. Jorge Lopez is going to be a free agent. I would be surprised if the Cubs picked up the option on Drew Smyly. It's a mutual option, so I think the Cubs are just going to pay him out and go. I think they added Caleb Knight to the third catcher to the 40-man roster at the end of the season as like a reward before he retires and goes to coach. That's what I've read. So there are 4 spots that clear almost right off the bat. And then you have a ton of decisions. And I think my next episode might be a deep look at the roster. They probably have 20 or so guys that are obviously going to stay on the 40-man. I mean, we're talking the major league starters, the guys on veteran contracts, the top prospects coming up, guys with options. You start looking at some of the relievers the Cubs brought in late in the season that don't have a lot of options left, or maybe in arbitration. Some of those guys are going to get cut down. The Cubs are going to have hard decisions to make on guys like Adbert Alzolay and Brennan Davis, given their injuries. I could see the Cubs putting them through the DFA process and see if they're able to clear waivers and potentially sign back on a minor league deal. I could absolutely see the Cubs signing, especially Adbert, to say like a 2-year minor league deal like the Red Sox did with Michael Fulmer, to let him really come back from his Tommy John surgery. I know he's pretty questionable to pitch in 2025. So that would allow him 2025 to heal and rehab and get stronger again, and then potentially start in the minors in 2026 and see what happens. Then the Cubs would have that access. And same with Brennan Davis. I just can't see them, especially with Owen Casey, Kevin Alcantara, Alexander Canario, close to major league ready on the 40-man. Somebody's almost certainly going to get traded, but it's sad. And I've heard nothing but wonderful things about Brennan Davis. And he's so much fun to watch when he's right. But I think it's so unlikely that the Cubs keep him on the 40-man over the course of the offseason. So we'll see some moves quickly. And then some of the tender decisions will come into that too, but not all those decisions have to be made within the first 5 days after the World Series. So they may take some time to think about Nick Madrigal or Patrick Wisdom or Trey Wingenter, Christian Bethancourt, for what they're going to do at catcher, things like that. But those moves will have to be made. And then the offseason will really start. The Cubs will also have to add Owen Casey, but they won't have to add him until late in November ahead of the Rule 5 draft, which is in early December. So that would be one more 40-man roster spot they have to clear, but it won't have to clear in the next week. So a lot of roster movements coming. I think it's going to be an exciting offseason. It's going to be exciting, at least in terms of number of moves. We'll see if the Cubs do it well and do it well enough to raise that projection into the championship zone for next year. But enjoy the World Series, what's left of it. The first World Series game was one of the most exciting games I've ever seen. Back and forth, great pitching, timely hitting, Freddie Freeman's walk-off grand slam, and then it's just been all Dodgers since. We'll see. While I think at this point want the Dodgers to win the World Series, I would like to see the Yankees make the series interesting. I do like drama. I like excitement. I love I was locked in for game 1 of the World Series, and I need more of that injected directly into my veins. But watch what's left. It's the last baseball we're going to have until spring training, and it's the last meaningful baseball we'll have until the Cubs and Dodgers open up in Tokyo next March. Go Cubs. Thank you for joining me today. If you like this episode, please drop a rating and a review wherever it is you get your podcasts, and share an episode with a friend. Just a few seconds from you gives me great feedback and helps other Cub fans find the show. You can find me on Twitter or X, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, Blue Sky, and YouTube, all at CubsPS Plus. And check out the Patreon page, patreon.com/CubsPS Plus, to help support the show. As always, the theme music for this podcast is Prospect Park West by Jerry McCoy. This is Mike Waller, host of the CubsPS Plus podcast. Every day with Cubs baseball or talking about Cubs baseball is a great day. Go Cubs!